Good afternoon, everybody that's here in person and online. I'm Ben Heckman. I'm the library director. I want to welcome you here to this important afternoon of conversation. I want to say thanks to Zach Parrish over there, man in the controls, for pulling this whole thing together. He was instrumental in bringing this afternoon to all of us today, so thank you for that. And I want to welcome you on behalf of the library and our collaboration with One Bexley. This is a One Bexley partnership. For those of you who's heard of One Bexley here. All right, excellent. Well, for those who haven't, which is maybe 12%, it's a collaborative initiative of the city, the Bexley City School District, and the Bexley Public Library. The mayor and the superintendent of our fair city and schools are here today, this afternoon, so thank you guys for being here. It's a multifaceted program designed to be deliberately and comprehensively bolster a community and culture that ensures that Bexley is welcoming and provides a sense of belonging for all community members and visitors. Together, we're working to build a community free from racism and prejudice in all forms, where all residents and visitors are valued, respected, and empowered to thrive. This program today is one of many that we have been working on since we started sometime last spring. And so we have another one coming up. The community dinner at Drexel, that was October 1st. If you didn't have an opportunity to go there, be on the lookout for it next year. It was a wonderful event. Today we have our conversation with Laura Meckler, and then we have the One Bexley Big Table conversation here at the library coming up this Wednesday at 6:30. And you can keep abreast of what's happening with the One Bexley project at bexley.org/One Bexley. So thank you for joining us today. We know that you could be elsewhere on this Sunday afternoon, but you chose to be with us, and we're really glad that you made that decision. I now want to introduce Kumi Walker, who is that's right. Yeah, that's right. Clap it out. He has been a very engaged citizen of Bexley since his family moved here in 2018. As a parent, he's been very involved in the schools. He has served as the Bexley Minority Parent Alliance and a strategic plan steering committee for the Bexley City Schools. He is the co-founder and managing partner of his business Embedded Services. Kumi has been an active member on the One Bexley project, maybe a co-founding member, working hard to fulfill its mission of deliberately and comprehensively, bolster a community and culture that ensures that we continue to be a welcoming space here in Bexley. I am so excited for this conversation. Kumi also has a wonderful background. I feel like I need to look at you. He grew up in a planned community in Maryland, and so asking him to participate in this conversation brought a whole nother layer of context that I think you guys will find interesting this afternoon. And so with that, Kumi, thank you for being here. Laura Meckler, thank you for being here, and I'll turn it over.
Thank you very much, and thank you for being here. I'm going to make sure your introduction is a lot more extraordinary. But I'm so grateful to be here. Before I read to you this extraordinary woman that we have with us, this is such a timely book, not only for our community, but for any community really in this country, and just so grateful that we're one of the first communities outside of Cleveland that's had an opportunity to spend time with this author. All right, you ready?
I think so.
In the illustrious world of journalism, few writers manage to bridge the gap between personal experiences and broad societal issues with as much finesse as Laura Meckler. As the national education reporter and writer from the Washington Post, her keen insights have not just been honed in the press rooms of the Washington Post, but also during her tenure with the Wall Street Journal and the Associated Press. With a collection of accolades that speaks to her dedication to her craft, including coveted George Polk Award, Laura has always been a voice of reason, clarity, depth in the world of journalistic writing. Her book, Dreamtown, Shaker Heights and the Quest for Racial Equity, is a testament to her unique blend of personal insight and professional acumen. Rooted in her own experiences of growing up in Shaker Heights, Ohio, the book paints an intimate portrait of a community that, on the surface, epitomizes the American dream of racial integration. Yet as she deftly uncovers, beneath the facade lie challenges that mirror those of many American communities. Challenges of racial equity, educational disparities, and the complex web of societal expectations. Thank you, Laura, for joining us today.
Well, thank you for that very generous introduction. Perhaps slightly over the top, but I appreciate it nonetheless. So thank you all for having me here. It's just really a pleasure to be with you.
So why don't we start with the title, Dreamtown? How did you come with that title, and give us some sense of the meaning behind it?
Sure. So the title comes initially from a 1963 Cosmopolitan magazine article that the issue put Shaker Heights on the cover with the headline, "The Good Life in Shaker Heights." And the occasion of this piece was they were writing a bunch of stories sort of about how Americans live now. And at that time, Shaker Heights, which, as you probably know, is an inner ring suburb of Cleveland, was the wealthiest city in America. And this article was described sort of the suburban dream of opulence and beauty, incredible architecture and, privilege and advantage. Without necessarily using those words, that is essentially what it was describing. And there's a line in the article that says, "This is the story of an American dream town come true." So that always kind of stuck with me, this idea of it being an American dream town. But as I thought more about that, I thought about how just a few months after that in 1963, Dr. King gave his very well-known speech in Washington where he described a different sort of American dream. And this is a place that also has been trying to make that dream come true too. So this question for me is, can one place live both of those dreams? Be essentially the suburban dream, the suburban utopia, if you will, of this idea where you have the best of everything, and also a place that's really striving to be one community with different races. So that's where the title comes from. And I'll just add one other thought from it, which is that I think some people see the title and think that it's meant to imply that, this is like the perfect place. It's a dream town. It's like, the Barbie dream house or something like that, and it's not that. And to me, the word dream in the title is actually more of a verb. It is a place that is dreaming. It is a dream town, a place where people are dreaming for something better.
So that's a great, when you talk about the 1963 Cosmopolitan, talk a little bit about that Shaker Heights. What was Shaker Heights at that time?
So Shaker Heights was founded at the turn of the 20th century by a pair of developers who were essentially trying to create the best of everything, exacting standards for architecture. The streets were laid out very deliberately as a garden suburb, which means that you're not just on a grid, but you have a lot of curving streets that go with the topography of the land. The idea that you would feel like you were living not just near a park, but actually in a park. Rather than living in the city, which is where everybody lived at the time. At the time, Shaker Heights was the sticks. This was like way out. Even though today, of course, it's considered very close to the city. I mean, it is. It shares a border, but it was a place where there was just a lot of beauty and a lot of wealth and a lot of excellent schools and cute businesses, no industry. It was just sort of a place, this idea of kind of the suburban dream.
But very little diversity at that time. Well,
basically no. I mean, in 1963, interestingly enough, not that the Cosmo writer really keyed into this at all, but I think there's a quick reference to it in that piece, but there had been, the first black families had started to successfully move into the community, one neighborhood in Shaker called Ludlow. So they started moving in the mid-50s, and that was the beginning of integration, and really what became a remarkable story of an embrace of integration and of diversity, and creating a story that was very different than what unfolded in most of America, which was when the first black families moved in, white flight ensued. And they wanted something different. So that's part of the story that I tell is about how that came about. But really what Cosmo was looking at was the other, it wasn't really focusing on that neighborhood, it was really looking at what was happening in the rest of Shaker.
So I know, so you're a journalist first, and this is your first book. You've really been, in some ways, working on this book for several years, and you decided to interview over 250 people over 7 to 8 years. Can you talk to administrators, community members, parents, teenagers, children, teachers. Can you talk a little bit about why you decided to tell this story from the perspective of the characters that lived in Shaker Heights?
Well, it was, and I didn't set out to interview 250 people per se. It just kind of, I added them up when I had a little blank at the end of the book where I talked to more than, and I counted them, and that's where I landed. You know, and you know, some of those are very brief conversations, and some were one person over and over again. It was very important to me that this book be narratively driven, and what that means is that it be a story of people. I just think that that's much more interesting to read about when the stories of actual people living their lives and making, creating community. So, you know, I don't know that anybody wanted to read a, you know, academic dissertation about what was happening, and I don't think that would be what I would be equipped to do anyway. So I thought that that was what I could bring to this, and I also thought that's what would make it the most interesting. My initial idea for the book was to just follow a few multi-generational families in Shaker and have their families carry the story from hopefully the beginning, you know, all the way to the present. And to make a long story short, I couldn't find the right families for that, and I decided I could spend the rest of my life looking, or I could try something else. So I decided the way I would structure it instead was that there were a lot of people whose stories I had learned over the course of the reporting. This started out as a story that ran in the Washington Post in 2019. I had started reporting it at the Wall Street Journal, and then I finished it, and it ran in the Post. And so I already knew a lot about, I mean, obviously I knew some from just living and growing up there, but I knew a lot from my reporting. And there were certain people I knew had interesting stories to tell. Just a little, like a side note, one day I was at my parents' house, and a friend of our family, a friend of my dad's, showed up and hands me this thick volume. It's like printed out, like binded, like from Kinko's, like book, and his father was superintendent of the Shaker schools when the first busing plan was adopted, and it was his unpublished memoir of his time at Shaker Heights. So he just said, "Here you go," and that was when I was working on the newspaper piece. And I was like, I didn't use any of it for the story in the Post. It was just way too in the weeds about something too long ago. But it was gold for this. So that was an example. I was like, well, he's a character. I want to build some of this around. So long answer to your question. I ended up, each chapter is anchored by a different character who is important at the time, and it's told chronologically through their stories.
Well, I think that you and I talked, and I think I've talked to anyone that will listen about The Color of Law by Richard Rothstein. Is just an incredible book that helps explain.
I read that and used some of that work in here too.
And I think that this is a very differently written book, and a lot easier for people to find themselves and their experience in it.
Yeah, it's a different book. I mean, that book is very much more
of a dissertation,
a little more academic. A great book in its own right. I mean, these two books could in some ways be read side by side, and for a full understanding.
So there are a number of different themes. That one of them that you talk about is just communication. But can we start talking about just, you said 1955 is really when the first families, 1925 was when the first black family tried to integrate successfully. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Sure. So, you know, I mentioned that when the Shaker Heights was developed, it was with these exacting standards and these restrictions, which were described as, these restrictions are meant to preserve the community, and some of those restrictions were about what color you can paint your house and what architectural style can you use. But there also were covenants on the deeds that restricted who you could sell to. Now, in some communities, it specifically said who you could not sell to. It would say you couldn't sell to blacks, couldn't sell to Jews, to Catholics, to Italians, in some places to people from Chinese descent. There were a variety of these covenants used around the country. In Shaker, the way it was written was you had to get permission from the Van Swearingen Company to sell your property. And we know who they granted permission and who they didn't, and the answer is they didn't grant it to any black people. And not only that, but those who did manage to buy were essentially harassed out. So for instance, in 1925, there was this couple named the Baileys, and he was a doctor, a very well-known, well-regarded doctor, and he and his wife bought this house, and they were just harassed by the police and by the neighbors. There was a big meeting at the high school. What are we going to do about undesirables, so-called? who were moving into our community. And, from what I can tell, it's not exactly clear when they left, but within a year or so, they were gone. So those who tried early on did not succeed.
And then in 1955, though, there were a number of families that were. How did they manage to buy property in Shaker?
Yeah, it was through quite a bit of creative work they did. I mean, it was not easy to do. So in fact, I think the first family, or certainly one of the first, if not the absolute first, were the Masons. The way they were able to buy, and it wasn't even in the city of Shaker Heights, it was the city of Cleveland, Shaker Heights School District, but even that was still verboten. He owned a property in the city of Cleveland, and a friend of his owned this lot in the Shaker Heights School District, and they swapped properties. So it never went through any realtors. So that was because realtors were the first line of, essentially racial police force. You couldn't just go on the internet and see what was for sale. You had to go through a realtor, and you were not shown homes. You were not given the option of buying a home in a white neighborhood if you were black. And let's say you managed to do so anyway. Well, then you had the banks who would come in, and they would not lend to you. And so he got around that by going to a black-owned bank. He was actually hauled in, his banker and Ted Mason were hauled into the Shaker Heights Savings and Loan by someone at the bank, probably the president of the bank, and he demanded to know from this banker, what are you doing writing a loan on that street? Now, this guy had nothing to do with this transaction, but he felt like he had the authority to call these people in and demand. He said, that's a white street. And the banker replied, well, I've been on that street. That asphalt is gray. But I doubt that the Shaker and Savings Loan guy thought it was funny. But there were all these, but they managed to get by this. And he actually said, he died before I started working on this, but I talked a lot with his son about this. And, Ted Mason said he always assumed something would have stopped it before they got to that point. But he managed through this. They needed approval from this architectural review board, and they had a white architect submit the plans for them. They needed approval from the city of Cleveland, and they had the councilman they knew sort of slip it in with a bunch of other things that were all being approved, and it made its way. So it was just extraordinary, the amount of work and things they had to do to get around all of these things to get in. That's just one example.
And so that's how those kind of pioneering black families entered Shaker. Can you talk a little bit about how Shaker started to change once the black families actually became more successful in moving in?
Yeah, so what happened there and in other places is that when a couple managed to get in, and then it's easier for the next black families to get in, and there's this enormous pent-up demand because there was no suburban housing available and a growing black middle class in demand of it. So the black families started to arrive in greater numbers. But really before that, the original reaction when the word got out about this house being built and another house being built for this lawyer and his wife named the Peggs, the Masons and the Peggs, those were underway, and there was a big meeting at the elementary school, which really resembled in so many ways that meeting at the high school I mentioned in 1925. Now it's 30 years later. Initially, it looks like it's going to be the same reaction. They even use the same terms, undesirables. What can we do? How can we stop this? But this time, there are some people who leave the meeting, and they are really unsettled by this, and they say, this is not okay, and they start kind of informal connections. And then fast forward about 6 months later, January of 1956, there's a bombing of the garage of the Peggs house as it's under construction. And
a bombing,
that the garage was bombed. And case was never solved, but a lot of people suspected it had to do with race, understandably suspected this. And on the day that they were cleaning up the debris, a group of white families showed up with coffee and cookies for the crew. And well, I'm sure they appreciated the coffee and the cookies really, and this was a bitterly cold day, as is usually the case in January in Cleveland. And but it was the statement, of them showing up. once they were in, more black families started to arrive. And really, it's looked like, even despite these early signs of support, that we were just basically going to see the same story, which is the neighborhood started changing. Black people are arriving, white people are leaving. They're goosed on by white real estate agents who are scaring them, using tactics known as block busting, where you go and they would call and they knock on their door relentlessly saying, you better sell now. If you don't sell now, there'll be no way out. You're going to be the last white people here. You're going to lose all the value of your home. I mean, so even people who might not have been inclined to leave or who didn't think of themselves as being racist were scared. Like,
right.
All my money is in this house. What happens if this becomes a quote unquote ghetto? Right. Which is how it was described.
And that was called, what was that called? Boosting? I learned that. Block busting. And the black and white realtors would work together. The white realtors would bring the buyers and the black realtors would bring the sellers, and they were all making money off of this. And the banks, meanwhile, the ones that wouldn't finance black people buying, now they wouldn't finance white people buying, because now the area was risky, and quote unquote. And so even white people who wanted to move. And so then this is where the story changes, though, where people who are living there are looking around, seeing for sale signs, like, we don't want this. And a group of black and white families took the radical step of having a barbecue together, getting to know each other, and that formed block clubs, and that ultimately created the Ludlow Community Association, which did remarkable things. They wanted to create and maintain an integrated neighborhood, and they set about doing it themselves, which meant drawing white families there. So they advertised the neighborhood, they advertised in the Cleveland Orchestra program, they advertised in the New York Review of Books. They said, come join us, we're embracing diversity. They weren't saying don't pay attention to this integration over there. They were saying, this is what we are, we're integrated, don't come be part of us. It's now this early 60s civil rights movement is gaining strength, and there are people who want to be part of this and who are drawn to this. They show houses themselves. They have parties where you come and have cocktails with people in the neighborhood. Maybe this elementary school principal is there. Get to know each other, then they show them what houses are available. They even have a financing arm it's amazing.
For a for-profit company that would give second mortgages to help with the financing of a home for white people, because that's who they were working to attract.
But they effectively had to recreate an ecosystem around home buying.
Yes, exactly.
And supply chain, they had to get demand. They had
the whole
to,
thing, everything from the advertising to the house hunting to the financing, they were doing themselves.
And this was in the 60s.
Yes, so late 50s to through the 60s.
There's an excerpt I'd like for you to read.
So now we're moving to the schools.
So integration is happening.
Right.
Shaker is this dream town. It's for lack of it's an affluent neighborhood with really great schools.
Yes.
And now there are more and more black families sending their children to the schools.
Yeah, and let's just fill in a little bit, real briefly, in between that and this, which is that now black families started to move into other neighborhoods too. It wasn't just Ludlow, it was some other neighborhoods too. And ultimately what happens is those neighborhoods replicate what Ludlow's doing, and ultimately the city itself takes it over through a housing office, and they're doing the same work I just described, now run by the city and financed by the city. So the community itself is now taking on this identity. And I mean, believe me, when the Ludlow people were doing it, there were plenty of people in Shaker who were like,
what are you doing?
They were not on board with any of this, but it didn't affect them. It was like one writer said, it was more of integration was more of a cocktail party conversation for them. They were across town. But it started to change and become part of the city's identity as a whole. So then we have a new superintendent arrive in the mid-60s. And we have, so.
This is Lawson.
So this is Jack Lawson. All right. So I'll just add, he started out, he actually redrew the boundaries for the two junior highs to racially balance them. And now he had been there for a couple of years. All right, we're in 1967. In 1967, Jack Lawson had been superintendent for 2 years when he addressed the district's teachers on the topic of integration. It had been 13 years since the Supreme Court ruled in Brown versus Board of Education that schools segregated by race were inherently unequal and a violation of the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment of the Constitution. Still, most school districts had yet to comply, and segregation was widely seen as a problem of the South, where schools were segregated by law. Lawson spoke at length, emphasizing that neither educational quality nor property values had fallen as the district added more Black students. Then he dropped something of a bombshell. He said the shift in student assignments for the junior high schools had gone well, and now the administration was studying elementary school, quote, patterns and alternatives in order to provide every boy and girl with integrated education at the elementary level. Shaker neighborhoods were defined by their elementary schools, and changing school assignment in the primary years was sure to be far more controversial.
There are a couple of things in there I wanted to touch on. The first was, the thing I love about the book, there are elements that are Shaker specific, but then it gives context to what's happening in the rest of the country. So I think as I grew up learning about Brown v. Board of Ed, you thought, okay, court case ruled, now we're integrated. Can you talk a little bit about what actually happened in terms of integration in schools?
Well, what actually happened initially was nothing. I mean, it was completely ignored. I believe the court ordered it to be done with all deliberate speed, one of the great oxymorons of history. And, the districts just flat out refused to comply. Ultimately, federal courts stepped in and forced districts to integration, first in the South. But then this became an issue also. Initially, Brown v. Board only applied to the South, to places where schools were literally segregated by law, where this is the Black school and this is the white school, not what's known as de facto segregation, which is what we had all across the North and the West, which was by neighborhood. It kind of worked out that way, just worked out that way, or where you would have lines drawn, but drawn in a way that was meant to keep people separated, but it wasn't a rule, a law.
Right.
So then the court started ruling that no, that also, that counts too. Those schools also needed to be desegregated under Brown v. Board. So that was what was in the air.
Right.
But there was never a court case in Shaker. There was never a court order, or as far as I could tell, any kind of a threat of a court order when Jack Lawson said we need to take this on.
So then the bombshell part was about elementary schools.
Right.
Can you talk a little bit about that in the context of Shaker?
Sure. So there were, at the time, 9 elementary schools, and there was one neighborhood called Moreland where this whole idea of housing integration had never really taken off. And it, in fact, did experience white flight, rapid white flight. And it was a mostly Black neighborhood by the late 1960s. And by 1970, this elementary school was 88% Black. And so he decided he was going to take this on. And his idea of desegregation, his plan was essentially to bus out Moreland kids in grades 4 through 6. The elementary schools went to 6th grade at the time, 4 through 6 to other predominantly or entirely white schools. So that's what he proposed.
And it was a one-way busing.
That's what he proposed,
right.
Was a one-way busing, which is what happened in many communities in America. Like the integration was on the backs of the Black families and the Black kids. And that's what his initial proposal was.
And in your book and in other books that I've read before, that part of integration, I think, we don't talk about that enough, but essentially Black students went from being taught by Black teachers and Black administrators to going into white classrooms where there were often just a handful of them in those classrooms.
Right, and there were a lot of Black teachers who lost their jobs in the process of this, where Black schools were closed, and people value neighborhood schools so much, but yet didn't really have a problem if a Black school in a Black neighborhood was closed, and then those kids were moved over to a white school. So, and it should be said in Shaker, there's a lot of evidence. I read all these documents that show that even before he proposed this plan, the parents in the Moreland community were upset about it. They kind of knew what was coming, and they said, we will not accept a one-way busing plan. We want a two-way busing plan. And by all indications, he essentially ignored this, which kind of actually speaks to one of the themes of what I view as one of the themes of the book, which is that there's a lot of messy middle here. This isn't really villains and heroes. I mean, Jack Lawson was an inspired leader who took this on, and I don't know that it would have been taken on without him. But this was a real blind spot that he had. Should we say how it actually ended up turning out, though? Interestingly enough, before the plan was announced, the Moreland parents protested. After the plan was announced, they protested. He's moving forward. He had a plan to use that space in Moreland for enrichment services that all kids would cycle through, and he was committed to that plan. He had already had foundation funding for it the day that he announced this plan. And but then what happened was sort of something unusual, which was that white families in Shaker also spoke up and said, "This is not. Why is this a one-way plan? Why are the black students the only ones who have to be bused?" And they volunteered their own kids to be part of it, and it ultimately became a two-way busing plan.
And you talk throughout the book, but part of the reason that that's so important in one-way busing situations tends to be a lot of things happen in and around the school just by the conversations that happen with parents after schools. Right. There's a lot of engagement that's required for your student, your child, to do well in school that goes well beyond you just sending them off to school and hoping they do well in the classroom.
Yeah.
So that was a pretty important part. And that also speaks to the coordination that seemed to constantly be happening in Shaker. So white parents were saying, no, we want our kids to go be bused the other way as well.
Yeah.
Did that continue? What happened with that?
Yeah, I think that commitment largely has maintained since then, and we get closer to the present, there are present day conflicts as well, which we should definitely get to. But in 1987, just pushing us forward a bit, there was they needed to close elementary schools, excess capacity. They closed 4 schools, 2 predominantly white, 2 predominantly black schools, and then redrew the boundaries for everything, and all the schools were then integrated from then on, and that's the situation that remains to this day.
So we are sticking with the schools, but let's talk a little bit about, big theme in the book is about academic performance and what happened with the black students in these integrated classrooms. Can you talk a little bit about that, and then we'll get to tracking and some of those other things.
The problem was they weren't integrated classrooms in many schools. They were integrated schools, integrated hallways, but because of leveling and tracking, where ability grouping essentially, there was a lot of segregation. And this started early, and it persisted for decades, and it was criticized for decades. But there were a lot of reasons for it, and it's complicated, but there's no doubt that disproportionately black students were being steered to lower level, regular level or lower level classes. White students opposite, and also white parents were advocating for their own kids to be in higher level classes, and all of this combined to create what was a very uncomfortable and pronounced segregation by classroom. And until recently, this formal tracking began very young in the 5th grade, which is a pretty young age by my counts as a parent of a 5th grader. I can say they're 10 years old. This is a young age for your fate to be sealed, and it isn't sealed officially. You could change, but as a practical matter, you don't,
Right.
And a kid gets put in enrichment in 5th grade, or he doesn't. And that sets the course pretty much for what happens from then on. And if I think about that as a parent, and a parent who has a fair bit of privilege of my own, what would happen to me if I was in that system of my 5th grader? Well, if I thought he could do the work, and I do think my 5th grader could do the work, if he wasn't picked for enrichment, I probably would call the principal and say, well, I think he can do it. Let's give it a try. We can give him support, or we can drop down if we have to, but maybe we should try this. And they probably would say yes, for if no other reason than to get me out of the office.
Right.
And that happens a lot. And some parents feel like they have the agency and the chutzpah essentially to go and ask for that, and some people don't. Right. And that is another thing that leads to this segregation.
So I'm going to ask you to read the next excerpt, and there's a lot in that tracking piece that I want to dive into after this. It's the one I took the other one out, so it's right in front of me.
Okay, all right. As Shaker schools grew more diverse, the district developed and expanded its system of sorting children into academic buckets called levels. With each step towards integration came more and more leveling, with white students moving into top classes at higher rates than black students from the start. Initially, advanced classes were only for a handful of the top students. Shaker schools first offered advanced placement classes in the mid-1950s. as the AP program was introduced to U.S. high schools, but most students remained in regular classes. In 1955, the district bragged that gifted classes were not generally needed because, much like in the fictional Lake Wobegon, all children were above average. Quote, in a sense, our whole school system is organized for the very capable child because our average IQ is 117, Superintendent William Slade wrote in the school review in December 1955. Tracking saw its first big expansion in 1964, when the district adopted a new and sweeping levels of instruction system, with courses classified as levels 1, the lowest, through 5, the highest. The high school was now about 7% black, and while the district did not publicly tie the change to the changing demographics, it was no longer bragging that all students were gifted.
So that sorting is starting to happen inside the building,
yes,
as opposed to outside of the community. There's an element of this. So I told you when we talked, I grew up in Columbia, Maryland, which for those of you who don't know, is one of, I think it was the first planned community in the United States, really built purposefully to be like a Shaker Heights by a great developer named James Rouse. And so I am a product of that. And I shared with Laura, and I'll share with you, this is the first book where I read and I had to stop reading because it was the first time I read an experience that I had. And I'll share, you asked me to share this, so I will share it in the context of the tracking. Every year from 1st to 5th grade, I was tracked in the lowest class. So I would go to school, and I would, at 1st grade, I didn't know any better, but I ended up, and I came home from 1st grade, and I'm like, here's the class I was put in. 2nd grade, I was either tracked in remedial or regular, because we had tracking from the beginning. So what happened from 1st grade, my parents, who were both attorneys, they came to the school the next day. They had to bring, when I was in 1st grade, they had to bring IQ tests. They had me take IQ tests because they were afraid, my mom, they're both civil rights attorneys, they knew that this was coming. So they had to bring IQ tests to prove that I should be in the top academic courses. So that was in 1st grade. In 2nd grade, I knew that if my instructions were, I didn't know how to advocate for myself. If you go into class and you don't see your friends from last year, go to the principal's office and they'll call us and we'll come in. And that happened 1st through 5th grade for me. And I think I've talked to my wife about this, but no, this was something that I just thought was my experience. But this seemed to be a theme that you came across in your book.
Sometimes I get asked what surprised me most in my reporting, and this is the answer, is that I knew that I would find stories like that, like the one you just told, which is really heartbreaking. Not for you necessarily, because you had parents who made sure you got in the right area, but for the system as a whole, because how many kids weren't? I found so many stories like this. Almost every black student, parent, alum who I talked to had at least one story along those lines. They all have different contours, different details, but this really is the systemic racism that you hear about. Like, this is what it is. Like, this is what it means.
Right. And you talked about there was a young woman that you met who you talked to, and you said that you were asking her, hey, why aren't you in the AP course?
When one of my visits to the high school, I was in a class, an English class, an 11th grade English class. It was a combined honors and regular, which was a step toward detracking, which ultimately was done in a much more aggressive way. But she was there, and she was in the honors. She was a young black girl, super bright, lots of great insights in the classroom discussion. I could just tell by listening to her, she just like had her stuff together. Yeah. And so I followed her out and I asked her, did you consider AP? And she said, I was in AP for one day, and then I looked around and there just weren't that many other minorities there, is how she put it. And so I went and talked to my counselor, and she said I could move down to honors if I wanted, so that's why I did it. And there's nothing wrong with being in honors. Honors is great. It's the right place for lots of kids. But if we think about that story, like, number one, the first problem is that she doesn't feel comfortable there in the first place. But then the second part of that problem is that why didn't that counselor say to her, listen, I know you can do this. I know you can do this. And we're going to get you support. And I'm going to talk to that teacher about making sure you have what you need. And we're going to find a friend for you who you guys can go do this together. And if you need help, come see me. And you know what? If it doesn't working, we can change again in a month. But let's just try it. You know, all of those things that you can do.
Right.
And I have to tell you, I've told that story several times, but just this week, I was at John Carroll University in Cleveland, right outside of Shaker, talking, and there were a couple teachers there, and they told me a story. This is maybe the best thing I've heard at all the events I've done, that just this year, I told the story on Fresh Air and the NPR show, and they said that they were, this came up again this year, a student who wanted to come out of AP, and that the teacher and the counselor said, remember what that was said on that podcast? Let's do this differently. And they told her to go back to AP, and they were going to try harder.
That's amazing.
So I was just really buoyed by that.
That's
amazing.
amazing.
I hope she does well.
That's amazing. This goes back to the teacher-student relationship. So you have this striving community, you have these superintendents and leaders in schools that are doing what they believe is the best to keep schools integrated and also help students have the best academic experience. Can you talk a little bit about kind of the messy middle and with the Olivia McDowell and Jody Podol incident?
Yeah, I'll try to summarize it briefly. There's a whole chapter about this situation. We should probably go to questions. Okay, so this was a Black student in a junior year AP English course, and she had been struggling a little bit in the beginning of the year, and the teacher, she came into class one day, and she didn't have an outline for an assignment that was due that day, and the teacher sort of spoke to her somewhat harshly, asked her some tough questions, why, what class did you take last year, how did you do, who was your teacher, what else are you taking now? The direct questions. She felt like trying to find out what was going on.
In front of the whole class.
But not loud in front of them, but loud enough that other kids could hear this, which was very mortifying to Olivia, who left the room, went to the bathroom in tears and called her mom. And the teacher realized right away something had gone wrong and apologized to her. But ultimately, the mom filed a formal complaint with the district and alleging bullying, that she had been bullying her daughter and implying racial discrimination, and led to a very protracted investigation, not handled very well by the district. For the superintendent here, just read that chapter and don't do it like that. Which if you're unfortunate enough to find a similar incident, it just was very painful and for everybody involved, and there ended up being sort of a big community meeting where a lot of this stuff came out and a lot of pain, and teachers who felt like, hey, am I not allowed to have a difficult conversation with a student without being accused of bullying? And meanwhile, a lot of Black students and parents who were feeling like, you're so worried about the teachers' feelings, like what about the kids who are in these classes? And here this is a district trying to get more kids to take, Black kids to take AP, and look what's happening to one who is in this situation.
Yeah, and there's a lot in this chapter. I think the reason I brought it up was the elements that really struck me was there were other students in her class, in Olivia's class, who were also late with their outline, but they had a relationship with Ms. Podol where they knew to let her know ahead of time, hey, I'm not going to be able to turn this in on time. The teacher, they didn't have any interaction with her in the class because they'd let her know. Olivia didn't have that same relationship with Ms. Podol. She wasn't used to telling a teacher she wasn't going to have something on time. So Ms. Podol learned of her not turning it in when she was supposed to turn in the assignment. There was just, and we'll come back to this, but after we open it up, but there's this concept of relationship, and you talk about it at the end of the book where the things you'd wish could have happened in Shaker, and you're hopeful as to what will happen going forward. But with that, I want to open it up for anyone that has questions. I could sit here asking your questions all day, but do want to open it up for folks that have read the book, or I just have questions for Laura. One question in the back, and then we will come to you.
not so much a question, but I graduated in 1998 from Shaker, so my family was moving in as you were graduating. And so my second year at Mercer Elementary, yes, that would be the east end of Shaker where all the rich people live, at least that kind of is the impression people have. My second year at Mercer was the year they started busing. And
1997 or 87?
I graduated in 98, so it would have
This was in
been
elementary
my
school.
second year in elementary school.
Yes, okay, that makes sense.
Yeah. And I don't really recall it so much. I think we all noticed there were some new students in the class that hadn't been there the year before, but the understanding that I had going through Shaker schools is Shaker Heights is the model of racial integration. Everything's great. Everything's fine.
Yeah.
And then I read your book, and this is, I guess, why I raised my hand, is grew up there, still have family there, never really understood what was going on in the community I was living in until I read your book. So thank you for that.
I think a lot of us grew up in Shaker feeling like this was a place that had race figured out. I certainly did as a kid. I sort of thought, well, the rest of the country, you've got problems with race, but we've got this, and it was never that simple, and I also learned a lot reporting this book, so thank you.
This gentleman had a question, then we'll get to yours, sorry.
We'll get to you too.
Yes.
Okay,
Those are
I've got a couple of questions. I'm a 1960 graduate of Shaker Heights High School. In my class, we had 5 black students. So I guess we had about 500 graduates in this class. So I guess from 60 to 65, they went from 1% to 5%. You said 7%. Black students in the class, in the high school graduating class.
Not
right?
necessarily. That was the whole district-wide, and I think that they maybe were younger kids families move in with younger kids typically, I think. So I don't know that that's exactly right, but overall, yes, there was change over the course of the 60s.
Okay, my question, I'm aware of Brown versus Board of Education and separate but equal is not equal and so on, but I was curious, what was the academic performance before grades 4 through 6 were bused into the other schools of Moreland School as compared with the rest of the Shaker schools? Was that the same academic performance, or was it inferior to the other schools in the Shaker, other elementary schools in the Shaker system?
I never saw any data that actually answered that question per se, but there was data about after the busing system, whether they did track the academic performance after busing to see if it had an impact, and they found that there was no impact to speak of. If to the extent there was one, it was positive for students bused into Moreland. So the white students bused into Moreland actually performed higher than expected, I don't have any data, unfortunately, on whether there was a disparity pre-busing.
Okay, now my other question, I said we had 5 black students in my high school graduating class out of over 500, a little over 500. Our supposition back then, and I didn't know any of the black students per se, they weren't in my group of friends, but our supposition was that at least some of them were the children of people who worked for white residents in Shaker Heights and lived on the premises and went to their local schools and went through their local schools into the high schools. Was there any incidence of that during that period of the 1960s where it was people who lived on the premises of other properties in Shaker and worked for the families?
Yeah, anecdotally, I've heard that. I think there were some cases of that, but I don't think that in any numbers, really what happened in the 60s, it was more about families moving into their own homes was really what the change happened. I think I've heard there were some kids here and there. But by 1960, you're graduating. I mean, it's very possible that maybe some of those early Ludlow families had older kids. I'm not sure.
One more question.
This woman.
She has the mic. This woman here. Yes.
She got it taken away from her, so got to give it to her.
That's okay, I can wait a minute. So my question has to do with if you had any research in the book, I haven't read it yet, about the teachers and administration. So just a little background there. When I read the book Little Fires Everywhere, which is fictional but takes place in Shaker Heights, I remember thinking to myself, wow, this place sounds a lot like Bexley, like just a lot of the descriptors and things in the book. And one thing I've noticed here is that we don't have a lot of teachers and administrators that aren't white. And I was just curious, you mentioned that like a lot of the teachers lost their jobs when they did integration, just how that is or how that has developed over the years in Shaker as far as diversity of the staff.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I should say, by the way, I didn't see any evidence that in Shaker black teachers lost their jobs when this happened. That's just what happened nationally.
Yeah. Okay.
So to be clear. And I mean, there is a very big difference between Bexley and Shaker. I mean, Shaker schools are, 40+% black, so and about 40% white. So I mean, that's from what I know, that is much different than what the Bexley schools are. So that is a big diversifying the teaching staff is the teaching staff does not reflect the student body population in Shaker. It's far more white. Now there are definitely black administrators and there are black teachers for sure, but not in proportions. And I should also say there is a lot of research that shows that for students of color, having even just one teacher of color of their own race can be a hugely positive impact on their academic course. So it really does matter.
Thank you.
I wanted to give you a chance. I know we're running low on time. The last chapter, you tell the whole book from a perspective of a journalist, but you also are from Shaker. And then really in the last chapter, you start to give your own perspective. I wanted to give you a chance to do that here. And you started to talk about at the beginning when you talked about dreaming. But can you talk a little bit about what are your feelings about Shaker schools now that you've done all of this research, you've written this book? Would you mind sharing a little bit about what you shared in your book at the end?
Like my final conclusion about the whole
right.
thing.
Without giving too much away, because we're trying to sell books here.
Yeah. No, we will not give too much away. Much more to come. I definitely, as I was writing the book, I don't know if this is what you're referring to, but I really struggled with the question of whether this was a story of success or a story of, essentially failure, because there is this big achievement gap still. And it's been persistent. Doesn't matter how you measure it. We talked about the different classes, but also through test scores, grades, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So on one level, you could say, hey, this is a community that's been trying all these times, but it's still obviously not serving kids equally. We don't have the same results. So maybe this is not this movie. This is a story of ultimately you tried, but you failed. But I ultimately came out feeling more hopeful than that. And I do feel like it is ultimately a story of success in the sense that, we live in a country where most people aren't even trying. Most people are really living with people who are mostly like them. You generally have wealthy, mostly white people with other wealthy, mostly white people. And then you have a lot of students of Black and Hispanic students, lower income in the same districts. And that's sort of what it looks like in most of the country. And this is a place that is trying to serve everybody in the same boat. I mean, just as a thought, which I think, might probably sounds like a good idea. I think most people would think that, yeah, that sounds like a good idea. And the idea that you would have that cross-subsidization, you have more opportunity for all. It is a system that tries to be more just. Not easy, but they're trying to do that. And most of America is not. And then we look at, urban schools or rural schools or places where there's high concentrations of need and high rates of poverty, and they have low test scores, and people are like, oh, those schools are bad. Well, it shouldn't be a surprise when you concentrate people with high needs in one place that you're going to have people who are struggling academically. The schools may be bad or they may not be bad. They may be great.
Right.
And vice versa the other way. So it's just we make a lot of assumptions, and people tend to cluster with people who are like them. And I do think Shaker's trying to do it differently, and I think that is really valuable.
Well, I think there's a thread of Shaker that I think is present throughout the country. I've talked to you about this. And I think the striving piece, certainly here in Bexley, is something that we are working on, not only because of the One Bexley initiative, the strategic plan that the superintendent just put forth really was grounded in equity. And I thank you for this book, quite frankly. It's really timely. I said that at the beginning. But it's timely for your community, which you wrote it about. I think it's timely for mine. I think of mine not only as the one I live in, but the one I'm from, but really for any community in the country. And I think really this issue of how we are thoughtful and think about and what we do, which I think was the most powerful thing about Shaker, was what you do for racial equity and equity in general, I think is really powerful and a timely message today. So thank you very much for joining us, and thank you for writing this book.
Thank you so much. Thank you for having me. I really appreciate it.